Order, and welcome to today's session of the Transport Select Committee, where we continue our pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft Rail Reform Bill. Today we'll be looking at the devolution angle of the topic, and for our first panel we are joined by colleagues from Cardiff. For the purposes of our record, could I ask you first just to state your name and position, please? Minister, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Ken Skates. I'm the Cabinet Secretary for North Wales and Transport.
Thank you.
And my name is Peter McDonald. I am Director for Transport and Digital Connectivity.
Thank you. We're very grateful to both of you for giving us your time this afternoon. And if I could start with you, Minister, just to briefly outline the Welsh Government's position on the draft Rail Reform Bill, please.
Well, thanks, Chair. I'm really delighted to be able to join you today. And just to set some context, if I may, I'll just outline some of the unique circumstances and instruments that we have in Wales, because with Transport for Wales, we effectively have a single guiding mind covering all modes of transport, and we have an ambition to create one network, one timetable, one ticketing regime through re-regulating buses with the bus bill. I guess the one piece of the jigsaw that we don't have concerns rail infrastructure, and we've long held the position we believe that should be devolved. I think the draft bill touches much on the work of the Williams review back in 2018, and I gave evidence to the Welsh Affairs Committee after their call for evidence concerning that piece of work. I think it's important that the draft bill builds on the Williams review, and I think there are certain changes that could be made to the draft bill that would enable a greater role for the Welsh Government and Transport for Wales to have in ensuring that we've got the infrastructure in place to meet the needs of rail passengers and indeed passengers of all modes of transport where integration and interchanges are required. We currently have control over the core Valleys Lines infrastructure. We're responsible for that. We've got Transport for Wales rail services operating in the South East Wales metro area, but we lack it elsewhere. We're also incredibly keen to work with communities and leaders of the regions on the English side of the border as well, recognising that the Wales-England border is incredibly porous, particularly in the northwest of England and North Wales, but also in the southeast, bordering with English communities there. And of course, the Mid-Wales into the Midlands corridor is vitally important for prosperity and social cohesion as well. So we work very closely with colleagues across the border. I think that recognises the fact that we believe in partnership. And at the moment, Welsh Government and the FW are still considered, unfortunately, in too many cases, as stakeholders rather than true partners. So I'd like to work with UK government more in shaping decisions around infrastructure in particular, but also rail services that impact on people in Wales, because at the moment we have barely any say, in truth, over rail infrastructure investment on the Wales and Borders route, nor do we have any real say in terms of the franchises that the UK government are responsible for in Wales, including, for example, Avanti and GWR.
Thank you. That's very helpful to put in context. And just before I turn to specific questions about the draft bill, it'd be helpful if you could just, for my own interest and clarity, what your existing working relationships are with bodies like the Transport in Merseyside and Transport for the North in looking at those cross-border services.
Well, thanks, Chair. I think you've touched on a really important point. I have returned to this role after 3 years on the backbenches, and I'm pleased to say that I think at an official level and also at a political level, the relationships are better than they ever have been. We work incredibly closely with organisations like Growth Track 360, for example, at assessing what sort of infrastructure we need on both sides of the border to promote better passenger transport. We also work with the Metro Mayors. We work with Liverpool City leaders as well, with elected members on both sides of the border. And in fact, I'm very keen that as soon as possible after the next UK general election, I meet with newly elected members of the UK Parliament, given they will have a very keen interest in cross-border services that are relevant to their electors.
Okay, thank you. Could you just outline to me, this piece of draft legislation has been in gestation for quite some time. What conversations have you had with the Department for Transport in trying to shape this to get it to its current form?
Well, unfortunately, I'm only weeks back in the job, so it might be better
or your predecessor.
I don't know whether the relationship was particularly strong and constructive between my predecessor and UK ministers, but I do know that at an official level, the relationship is excellent. I've heard that the relationship at an official level is better than it ever has been, but I think it might be helpful if Peter can outline the sort of relationship and discussions that have been taking place in recent years.
Thank you, Minister. So obviously we've had a dialogue with the Department for Transport for some time, given the length of gestation that you referenced, and that relationship is reasonable. But in addition, we have a relationship with the Great British Railways transition team, and we are working with them to try and construct a model for how devolution in Wales could be best reflected in GBR. Now, that is often, I would say, non-legislative preparation, so it might not be directly relevant for your consideration of this bill, but it helps us be ready once there is legislation passed through Parliament to react to it.
So if I could ask a follow-up question, do you think the concerns and suggestions that you've made in your opening comments today, have they been listened to? Or have they been rejected, or what's the state of play with them?
I think it might be cruel of me to say they've been rejected. I think they haven't been given sufficient attention, and I'd very much welcome further conversations about how we can progress our long-term ambition to see greater powers for Welsh Government over rail infrastructure decisions and over rail services that impact on Welsh citizens.
Thank you. I'll return with some questions later, but Gavin, if I could turn to you now, please.
Thanks so much, Chair, and good afternoon, Minister. The Welsh Government said in its submission that the proposed arrangements for the delegation of powers from Welsh ministers to the integrated rail body were practically inoperable, which is similar to some of the submissions we've had from the Scottish Government, who we'll see tomorrow morning. Can you explain why the Welsh Government's come to that conclusion?
Sure, I just can't envisage, I'm afraid, the situation where we would wish to delegate, given the amount of time that it took to have powers devolved to the Welsh Government in the first instance, and given the accountability that is now in place and the relationship between user groups, between regional interests in Wales and the borders area. And to then remove all of that and delegate over to GBR, I just don't think would necessarily be in the best interests of rail passengers. I think that in terms of devolution, it's a process rather than a single event, if you like. And I think there are benefits that can be realised through the creation of GBR and greater, closer working and a greater say for Welsh ministers over decisions that GBR would make.
I understand that, because I would imagine we'll hear something similar tomorrow morning from Fiona Hislop as well, in terms of the desire to have the Secretary of State, the IRB to decide the franchise within Wales or indeed Scotland. In terms of the other arrangements that currently exist, which are at the moment fairly complicated and convoluted in terms of who is responsible for infrastructure, etc., which there are similarities obviously between the Scottish situation and yourselves, although clearly there are differences which you point out in your submission as well. What would need to change in that to make this potentially workable?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. There is not symmetrical devolution at the moment between Wales and Scotland.
Yep.
So, as a very minimum, we would like to have the same powers the Scottish government enjoy at the moment, and I outlined those in our written evidence. I think in terms of examining what further attention should be given, I think it's important to note that we're on a journey at the moment in Wales. We are about to complete in the next 24 months the South East Wales Metro, where we're in charge of infrastructure and services. We're seeing significant improvements in terms of timeliness of trains, fewer cancellations, and so forth. So we need to have as much power and influence as possible over the decisions that are taken on infrastructure investment. At the moment, one of the problems that we've got is we're classed alongside the Western area, and that means that investment in railway infrastructure across the Wales and Borders area is pitched against investment decisions from the Thames Valley over to Bristol and beyond. And because of the way that the Treasury operates, because of the way that investment decisions are made, we're always going to see a disadvantage for the rest of the Wales routes, because we're always having to compete with more affluent areas where there are higher passenger volumes. And it's a fact of the matter that here in Wales, we have, as a proportion of the population as a whole, the fewest number of people that are actually using rail travel. That demonstrates a major opportunity to increase the number of people using rail as their primary transport mode. But it requires the decisions to be in the hands of those who are serving their communities. And in this instance, that means with Welsh ministers and with Transport for Wales.
Well, just on that, in terms of proposed levels in the draft bill, proposed levels of accountability with regard to the IRB, how, in your view, would the relationship have to work between the Welsh Government, the IRB and the Secretary of State to make all of this workable? What's your best case scenario in that respect?
Best case scenario would be eventually to have devolution rail infrastructure decisions made, or devolution to Welsh Government, and in terms of the actual services that operate, a formal role of partnership in terms of specifying and holding to account those operators that are not in the hands of Welsh Government's gift. So at the moment, Avanti, Cross Country and GWR, that'd be the best case scenario, but it would require some pretty hefty changes to the draft bill to realise that. Yeah. But it would be in the spirit of wanting to work in partnership with the UK government and with GBR.
And let's be cynical for a second and assume that those changes won't be made and it won't all be devolved to yourselves. What's the next best option? With the current bill as it's drafted, what changes would you make to that to make that relationship work as best as possible, short of devolving it all to Wales?
If I may, I'll just bring in Peter on this for some of the detailed points. Peter.
That's fine. And I think it's worth saying there are things that can be done through legislation that do not fundamentally alter the current devolution settlement. And I'll give you 3 examples. The first example would be to allow Welsh Government to explore the full range of options for the current Wales and Border franchise. So at the moment, there are a series of DfT, Secretary of State Transport controls on that franchise, even though we operate it and we bear the vast majority of the financial risk of that franchise. The second example would be to have a clearer and more real levers over the decisions on the other 3 franchises that operate in Wales, as the Minister has just described. That could be put in place through legislation with no change to the current devolution settlement. And finally, there could be proper levers for Welsh Government and the Welsh Parliament to hold Network Rail to account for its activities in Wales. And all of those 3 things can be done within the existing devolution settlement and without prejudice to further changes to devolution, which may happen in the future.
And sorry, only go, Minister.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think also we could look at the Wales Rail Board as well, strengthening its role, ensuring that the Wales Rail Board doesn't exist just to make recommendations and to consider investment opportunities, but it does have a direct influence over the decisions that are made.
Okay, a quick final question from me, Chair. In terms of this bill, and obviously we've spoken about the kind of rather convoluted arrangements with we have, and perhaps in your case, perhaps even more convoluted than we have in Scotland. With the IRB coming in and changing some of those arrangements, is it possible that it makes those arrangements and those structures more complex for the devolved authorities like Wales and like Scotland compared to the current situation? Is that possible?
There may be a risk of that happening, and that's why I mentioned actually at the outset the importance of the Williams review. That was described at the time as a root and branch examination of rail. I think the draft bill perhaps should build on that a little bit more, so that we can have simplification and clarity rather than the, as you say, a pretty complicated system that we have at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Graham, you wanted to come in next.
Thanks, Chair. You've covered some of the ground that I wanted to ask, but I mean, this inquiry, we're looking at the draft bill, we're doing the pre-legislative scrutiny here, so notwithstanding your concerns about the devolution settlement and the implications for the franchises that are operating in Wales, earlier on in response to questions from my colleague Gavin Newlands and from the Chairman, Minister, you said that you stressed the importance that these powers should be devolved. Well, given that we're dealing with the bill as it's presented to us, clearly the next panel that are giving evidence, including Martin Tugwell from Transport for the North, may have a different view. But from your perspective, is the power to delegate franchising functions to the Integrated Rail Board something the Welsh Government wants? And how would the legislation need to be amended as it's currently presented in order to satisfy your concerns?
Thanks for your question. I think as it stands, I can't comment on regional leaders in England and what they may wish to see happen, but I do think that as far as Wales is concerned, delegation to GBI would not be something that the Welsh ministers would consider at any point in the near future. Peter?
Just to say that the ministers commented on the question of whether it's desirable. I think even if it were desirable, as the minister says it is not currently, I think there are problems with the power as conceived in Clause 3. So firstly, there is no power of revocation. It's difficult to revoke. It requires the consent of the Secretary of State in the Department of Transport to proceed with it. And we would be giving power, delegating power to an IRB for which we have no direct route of accountability. So if you can imagine the situation of if something were to go wrong, we don't have control over the revocation and we don't have a route of accountability to hold the IRB to account. So even if it were desirable, and the Minister has explained how it is not, in technical terms, it's not something we could recommend to ministers using.
Will the Welsh Government be seeking representation on the IRB, direct representation? Is that something that's envisaged?
It's certainly something that we have pressed for at many times in our dialogue with the Department for Transport and colleagues in UK government. And given how much activity Network Rail does in Wales, and given how much expenditure happens on the railway in Wales, a clear and real form of accountability is a necessary quid pro quo.
And I think in the very least, we'd expect a very strong Wales business unit as well to make sure that we have that focus, as I've mentioned on a number of occasions now, on infrastructure improvements within Wales that aren't competing for investment in other parts of the UK.
Are there any other provisions that you would like to see on the face of the bill that aren't included?
I have no more comments on any other provisions that we'd like to see on the face of the bill. I think everything's been captured in our evidence so far, I think.
Peter?
I'll just make one point to build on the points I made about accountability with respect to Network Rail, and that many of those points equally apply, I think, to the Office of Rail and Road Regulation.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Carl.
Thank you, Chairman. Curveball for the Minister, really. I don't think the Welsh Government, but you might correct me, are ever going to put the money forward to build a road from North to South Wales. And at the moment, anybody who wants to travel by rail has to go outside the country. Would you ever consider, if you had the power, rebuilding and putting back in place the 60 odd miles or so that would join Aberystwyth and Carmarthen going through Lampeter?
Well, the estimated cost of that, I think, and this we're going back several years, was about £800 million. So it's a very considerable investment. And if we were to adjust that for inflation now, you'd be looking, I imagine, at over £1 billion for that particular route. That would be a huge piece of investment, and we'd need to judge whether the passenger numbers would actually justify that piece of infrastructure being returned. We also have, because I've mentioned about TfW's role in planning other services, we also have something called the Trawscymru Network. The Trawscymru Network is a coach and bus based network, and that supplements the rail network for long journeys within Wales. And that, I believe, is a far better service in terms of cost benefits than reintroducing a major piece of infrastructure that may not carry sufficient passengers to actually justify the case.
Yeah, I don't suppose many of your colleagues or Assembly members use that service, though, I would have thought, to get from North Wales to South Wales.
The Trawscymru service, most people use, because of the nature of the topography of Wales and also the existing rail lines, most people would use, coming from the north to the south, the line from Holyhead down across to Chester, and then head south from Chester to Wrexham onward to Hereford down to Newport, and then across to Cardiff. That would be the obvious route for most members of the Senate if they were to travel by rail. However, because of years and years of underinvestment, that route actually still has Victorian signalling in parts. So we really do need to see the underinvestment of the rail network in Wales adjusted, not just for the benefits of members of the Senate, but for the passengers that rightly so deserve a better standard of rail transport in Wales.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I'd just like to conclude this short sentence with a couple of supplementaries based on what you've just said to colleagues. You made the point, both of you, that investment in Wales in the rail infrastructure is in competition with other parts of the network, and consequently you would like formal representation on the IRB. I'd just like to probe that a little further, and how you see the IRB working when it considers investments that might not physically be in Wales but would be to the benefit of Wales. So I recall a number of years ago there was an expensive upgrade of Reading Station and Junction, which is some miles away from the border, but improved the capacity of the Great Western Main Line as a whole. How would you see the IRB working in assessing those decisions where, say, the spend and pounds might physically be in one part of the country, but the benefits spread more widely?
Well, it's very interesting, actually, to draw an actual example of how partners can work together to promote infrastructure in one part of the UK that actually has very significant benefits for people living across that national border, and that's the Wrexham to Bidston line. And for years, we've been seeking investment in that line to enable us to run metro-type services, 4 trains an hour, ideally through to Liverpool. So we work very closely with our partners in Liverpool and Liverpool City region. But because we don't have a direct say in Network Rail, we've never been able to draw down the investment that's required to upgrade that line. So with the IRB, what I'd be hoping for at the very minimum is a very strong Wales business unit that's able to allocate funding for infrastructure improvements within the Wales area, but also for us to be able to work in partnership with colleagues across the border rather than as stakeholders. Because we do recognise that infrastructure improvements on the English side of the border can have huge benefits in terms of services for people in Wales. And I've just highlighted one actually to the previous question. The line from North Wales to South Wales, which passes through the borders area of England, is vitally important. And I think I've spoken on very many occasions with previous DfT Secretaries of State about the need to improve that rail infrastructure on the English borders side, as well as in Wales.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Other witnesses to our inquiry have made the point that this draft bill is just one piece of a much wider jigsaw, and are not too concerned that the bill is relatively narrowly defined in its scope. Are you broadly content, notwithstanding the amendments you've already said that you would like to see made, are you broadly content with that approach that's been taken, that this bill is sharp and focused, and much of the rest of the infrastructure can be built around it?
Yeah, sharp and focused. I'd love it to be more ambitious, as I've outlined, but I'm a pragmatist as well, and I recognise that this is a starting point. It's difficult to argue against, but I think moving forward, something that has greater detail, obviously, would be beneficial, but also something that has greater ambition. I think we really do have a magnificent opportunity through the creation of a single guiding mind, where there is very powerful representation by the regions in England and the nations, to be able to create something that reflects what British Rail was at its best, and its best came very late in its day, actually. We don't need to reinvent or resurrect what British Rail was, but I think we can learn that when it operated best, it operated with a very strong degree of devolution.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Final question. Is there anything else that you'd like to put on the record as part of our inquiry?
I think I've covered most points, Chair, but just once again, I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity to be able to contribute, and I look forward to appearing again at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very grateful to both of you for your time this afternoon. We'll now do a short adjournment while we change panel. Thank you again. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome to our second panel today in our consideration of the draft rail reform bill. Before I invite the panel to introduce themselves, I should just point out that we are expecting a division in the House this afternoon, so we may have to interrupt proceedings, but hopefully we'll get the lion's share of the discussion before we get to that point. Starting on my left, can I firstly, just for our record, ask you to state your name and organisation, please. Maria.
No, thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm Maria Machancoses. I'm the Chief Exec at Midlands Connect, the national transport body for the Midlands.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Andrew Summers. I'm Chief Executive of Transport East. We're the subnational transport body for Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Southend and Thurrock.
Thank you.
And I'm Martin Tugwell, Chief Executive of Transport for the North.
Welcome all, and again we are very grateful to you for your time this afternoon. If I could start off by asking each of you in turn, just to state whether you welcome the broad propositions in this draft bill and why it is important to the regions that you represent. Maria, if I could start with you, please.
Thank you. Yes, as presented in the evidence, Chair, the Midlands really welcome the bill as it stands, the ethos of the bill, particularly this whole idea of bringing track and train and the guiding mind for the railways is really important to the Midlands. There is already an acknowledgement, and hopefully we have set that out in our evidence, that this is just a piece of the puzzle, and we need to make sure that although we understand there'll be other steps coming as we set up GBR and the ITB, we need to make sure that there is a wider understanding of how the railway fits with the wider transport system, and also how in the shaping of not only the contractual arrangements or the franchising arrangements with private sector and contractors, we also need to look at the long-term strategic planning of the network, and rather than just going into contractual arrangements for 6-7 years. We've got to make sure that when we create a GBR, a new guiding mind for the UK in terms of the railways for England, there's a big understanding of how that will interface not only with other transport infrastructure, but also with the place-making agenda. And that's when we see some national transport bodies being a useful platform for the GBR to engage with and to shape the network together, rather than quite clearly our Welsh colleagues and the Minister have set out. Is the difference between partners and stakeholders. So we welcome it. We notice this is the beginning, but a lot yet to do to make sure that this works in the future.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So Transport East is comprised of our local constituent authorities. So our board is comprised of elected members from our local transport authorities and our planning authorities, chaired now by an independent chair. And following on the point of integration, we've set out a transport strategy that's been endorsed by our local authorities, endorsed by the Secretary of State, and with clear outcomes around decarbonisation, better connectivity to support the economy, energising rural and coastal communities, and also unlocking our ports and airports. And those are our fundamental goals to support the economy, environment and society. And this rail reform bill is fundamental. As Mrs Machancoses said, it's a key part of the jigsaw. But those local authority leaders don't have any formal role or voice in the rail decision process in their places. So no say over rail investment and no say over rail services. So we really welcome this draft bill, but really see an opportunity here for it to go a little bit further and make sure that the decision-making abilities of local places are part of that wider picture. And then what we think is that will deliver better outcomes, because it's those local places that have the first sight of what is happening in those local areas. So the ability to integrate rail with planning processes, with the economic strategies that are now being developed with local transport plans. The view of our board, as we've set out in our submission to you, is that the subnational transport body is the best place for the East to be able to have that integration with rail reform. There's almost a neat, ready-made solution here where all of our partners are currently going through devolution deals, but they have seen the subnational transport body, Transport East, as the place at which they wish to have that interface with rail reform and Great British Railways going forwards. We've already put in places some of the structures to enable that to happen through our rail leadership group, through our working with Network Rail. So the primary focus here is the ability to integrate rail reform with our wider transport strategy to enable local decisions to be made that support the rail industry's role in delivering the outcomes in local places. Thank you.
Thank you. And Martin.
Thank you, Chair. And clearly, we recently published our revised strategic transport plan, which has been through quite an extensive process. And like my colleagues, it has been underpinned by one of the most comprehensive evidence bases focused around the economy, decarbonisation, but also reducing social exclusion. And we know from that evidence base that the role of the rail network has in terms of actually making that transformation. So we've set out in our evidence the nature of our relationship at the moment within the rail industry, which is slightly different from other English regions at present. We've got clear statutory and contractual arrangements between ourselves and the Secretary of State and the Department. And I think as we move forward, we would want to be building on those and having that kind of similar level of relationship with an integrated rail body of whatever nature it comes forward. But I think the focus here has to be about understanding what the role of the rail system is relative to delivering outcomes in the community. And that means a shift in culture and a shift in emphasis, I think, within the rail industry to thinking about outcomes in terms of places and people. And I do think that's where subnational transport bodies are particularly powerful, as that place where the local political and business voice come together to actually set out that vision for that community.
Thank you. And if I could just follow on from that, you've mentioned previously that a concern that your current statutory rights are not going to be replicated under this bill, whether that's by design or an unintended consequence. Transport for the North is unique amongst the subnational transport boards because you are on a statutory basis, the others are not. Now, there's a wider debate probably to be had about whether that is desirable or not. But should there be a separate relationship for Transport for the North? And if not, how do you bring in the other STBs that don't have that current statutory power?
Well, I'll leave my colleagues to maybe give an insight as to how they would want to see it. But you're right, Chair. We have our powers are devolved to us by Parliament through a statutory instrument, our primary powers. Our powers and the way we were set up was with devolution of responsibility from the department. And indeed, our constitution is very clear that we are a statutory partner of the Secretary of State. I think that needs to be seen alongside the Rail North Agreement, which is a contractual arrangement between the North and the department in respect of the Transpennine and the Northern contracts. And we have architecture and governance within the North through mechanisms such as the Rail North Committee, but supported by our own regional specifier, who a team of dedicated people who work across TfN and the department, specifying, monitoring and overseeing delivery of that performance. It gives the political and business leaders in the North a really strong input and an ability to shape and challenge. We heard from the Welsh Minister about the importance of challenging and holding these bodies to account. If I reflect upon some of the more recent conversations we've had as a body in relation to the East Coast Main Line timetable, the strength and the importance of having local voices feeding into and holding the industry to account when changes that are being proposed, which may seem sensible from an operational perspective, actually have implications for communities and users. So I think that level of accountability we have is important. I see no reason why we shouldn't be able to have the same kind of relationship with the integrated rail body. But I think I would also have to make the point that given that we are a body that exists by statutory instrument, then that relationship with the Secretary of State would still be equally important to maintain.
Thank you. And I could ask Maria and then Andrew to comment on that, given that you're not on the same statutory basis. You may wish to be, but currently aren't. What challenges might that give if the bill is to reflect that involvement?
If I may, Chair, I won't go into the details of why we are or we're not. I think the most important thing from a Midlands perspective is that we acknowledge that the Department for Transport and Government have always treated Midlands Connect as an equal to all of the STBs. Regardless of the statutory status. That's been made very clear to our board because those conversations are kept regularly in our minds, why we should pursue statutory or not. I think the point that we made earlier is our relationship with the Department for Transport and the Secretary of State is very clear, is understood. We are there to bring leadership and consensus around amongst all the leaders in the Midlands and to advise government on priorities. That is still strong, and we indeed are very proud of the way we have almost broke the mold in terms of how we're working with Network Rail on schemes of a strategic importance like the Midlands Rail Hub, where Midlands Connect is equal partner with the Department and Network Rail in the shaping and the concept of the programme, and we're really pleased of how we're working on that. Now, a statutory status obviously always gives you that more relevant presence and in the decision-making, in terms of consultation, a statutory consultee, and so on. But we still feel at the moment, given that the region, the weight of the leadership and the consensus in terms of advising directly to the Secretary of State on priorities, that should not be underestimated by GBR. and we hope, and that's what we would like to see reflected, the acknowledgement of STBs to be a good place for GBR to engage with, and in fact there should be a provision, that's one of the asks on our submission to you, a provision in the licence to acknowledge that requirement for GBR to engage with STBs. For the reasons that I explained, yes, statutory is a debate that we will have and will continue to have with this government and with the next government, because there's a lot of appetite to understand what's the appetite by government to put the rest of the STBs in statutory footing. But in the meantime, as I said, we should never underestimate the importance of our board and the consensus and the weight that all of the leaders of the Midlands represent in terms of our advice to government, direct advice to the Secretary of State on what the Midlands requires from the railways.
Thank you. And Andrew, do you concur with that, or are there additional points you'd like to add?
From our perspective, we have got all of our local transport authorities currently ambitiously looking at devolution deals with government, which we fully support. But the one area that is not going to be covered in that will be strategic rail, and that's exactly the area where they have seen the subnational transport body can come in to represent all of them, and it fits relatively well. There's no sort of metro mayors, there's no body like TfL in our region, so the STB is well placed. And indeed, what our leaders have said at our recent board meeting is they now want us to scope that role in more detail. So we're developing a strategic case for what an evolved role for Transport East would look like in the context of being a devolution partner. And as I said earlier, rail is one of those strategic areas which is best done at scale, like a region. And our local leaders are therefore very supportive of us taking forward that more formal role with the integrated rail body through this legislation, as they see that it's the best vehicle to deliver the outcomes that we've set out in our transport strategy, ensuring rail takes place alongside the other decisions that those local authorities are currently responsible around buses, around active travel and around the road network.
Thank you. Gavin.
Thanks so much, Chair. I often have a put my head-to-head with the Rail Minister, and because of our different views and potentially public versus private, etc., he'll sometimes bring up dogma and what have you. He'd said previously he was agnostic as to whether it was private or public ownership, but he just wants it to run well. So I was rather surprised to see the condition or the annual report for the increase in the involvement of private sector in the rail industry. Maria, you said in your written submission that the requirement for the IRB to produce this report placed too much emphasis on that specific area. What other outcomes do you think the IRB should be perhaps held to account for, perhaps rather than this or as well as this, or whatever? If you perhaps you could expand on that.
So we were not challenging the fact that there was a particular focus on the private sector. What we're saying is that there should be a bit more focus on the wider activity of GBR and how they report progress against their activities in terms of engaging with regions, engaging with other modes of transport and infrastructure, other sectors. You know, one thing that we're learning in all the STBs is when you plan for infrastructure, you now need to consider energy, you need to talk about digital. So that emphasis on the private sector was welcome, given that there's a huge emphasis on how in the future what's the role of the private sector in a GBR context. However, it shouldn't just be limited to private sector. So there were two things. We were very keen that some national transport bodies were given the opportunity to influence the annual business plan and to shape it. And also, in terms of the reporting of the activities, it shouldn't just be put on the private sector to report activities of their own within the GBR system. It actually should be the GBR itself of how they're engaging, how they're programming, how they're planning for activities in general. So that's the point that we're making.
So should there be perhaps an overarching report from the IRB in terms of, yes, rather than just the private sector report will actually be part of it?
I think it ultimately should be part. If we are talking about bringing track and train together, you cannot do this in isolation. This is the danger. If we start to putting reporting by separate entities in difference, there is a danger that we won't see an integrated way of communicating activities. One of the big things that the private sector, indeed, the industry in the Midlands, you know, we've got a massive rail supply industry in the Midlands, is the lack of clarity. So, you know, with reporting activities, we also mean what's your business plan, and not in the next year, but also in the next 5 and 7. So we're just mindful at the moment, the legislation, the bill as it stands, is just concentrating on very short-term tools to allow for reporting. It's not allowing, or it's not even making reference that as part of that there'll be wider requirements to provide more longer-term planning tools into GBR and how they will work with private sector and indeed with bodies like some national transport bodies in the planning of future business cases, in the planning of future business plans.
You guys, Martin, you've got...
If I may, I was actually going to reflect upon what Mr. McDonald said in your previous session, and I also had the benefit of visiting colleagues in Transport Scotland only last week, and I think the issue, building on what Maria has said there, is about the outcomes. And I think what we've seen recently on what I took away from my visit to Scotland is the progress that's been made in terms of having absolute clarity across all aspects of the industry as to what the common set of objectives are that you're trying to achieve. And in contrast, if I look at the challenges we've had on the East Coast Main Line, where we've had not just franchised or contracted operators, but we've also got freight and we've also got the private open access operators, it's increasingly becoming clear that the criteria that, say, the ORR are using to determine whether that capacity is the right way of using that capacity may not always be in complete alignment with what the industry would argue, or indeed what we would say as a subnational transport body. And I think there are some lessons to be learned from how in Scotland you've got that alignment around a common set of objectives. The structure as to how you operate, you can have a debate about, but if you've got that single view about what you're trying to achieve, it makes it easier to judge how you make best use of what is always going to be a limited resource, which is the capacity on the railway. And it's just, I think there's an area there to perhaps explore, again, building on what the Welsh Minister said.
Just before I come to Mr Summers, would you say that obligation about this report on the private sector, it could be anything, but that narrow report is an example of perhaps the siloed approach that you see in not just the rail sector, but actually transport more widely, because there's not that overarching strategic approach to transport in England.
And I think it's about this focus on the outcome. So in the strategic transport plan, we've focused about what's the economic outcome we're trying to achieve. What is it that we're trying to achieve in terms of reducing social exclusion? And in there is a very clear target about how we need to increase the share for public transport from 36% or so, what it is now, to 51%. That means that we've got a very clear evidence base that we need to grow the rail market, and we need to grow it at a scale and at a pace to be able to deliver those economic, social and environmental benefits. Now, we need the railway industry to then work and show how they will use the investment that's available, and it is a considerable amount of investment being put in the railways, but how to make best use of that to deliver the outcomes. So my response to your particular question there is focus on the outcomes, be clear about what they mean for people and places, and then require the rail industry to work with organisations like Transport for the North, Transport East, Midlands Connect, to define what that means and what the role is for the rail industry, and then hold them to account through a monitoring and evaluation framework.
Sorry, Mr Summers, but should that be on the face of the bill?
I think in terms of what the bill is trying to achieve, it performs its function. I think these are issues for me which come into what the operating model might look like moving forward, and I think that is a subsequent discussion, to be perfectly honest, at this stage.
Okay, thanks. Mr Summers?
Yeah, I agree with what both the others have said here, but just to add a bit of flavour onto what that might look like from an Eastern perspective. So, for example, our transport strategy, one of the key outcomes is carbon reductions, and you might see that an annual report looks at measures such as that, which could be measurable over the course of a year, and start to drive some of the decision making. I guess I agree that private sector investment in the railway is very important, but if that's one of your primary drivers, I guess what gets measured gets managed, and the problem is that there might be some other very valid outcomes that are not measured and therefore not prioritised in decision making. Just to provide a sort of a micro example of this from the east of England region, Clacton is a town by the coast, 50,000 people. There's a lot of different sources of investment going in there at the same time. One of our aspirations through our evidence base is to increase the frequency between Colchester and Clacton from 1 train an hour to 1 every half hour. But the decision-making process for that is very narrowly defined within a financial set of criteria. What we're saying is, if that annual report was able to take in wider criteria, it could include other government investment, and there's £20 million of levelling up funding going into Clacton at the minute, which adds to the overall package of increasing rail connectivity as well. So if you're able to look a bit more widely at both the private sector investment and other sector investment going in there, some of your decisions might change or might have different outcomes if you have that broader set of criteria we're measuring against.
Thanks. And just a yes/no question to finish. In their submission, Maria's had said in their submission they'd prefer to see the IRB report annually on the delivery of an industry strategic plan, which obviously part of that could well be the role of the private sector within the rail sector. Would yourselves, Andrew and Martin, would you agree with that, yes or no?
Yep, I would.
You would? Okay. Thanks.
Graham.
Thanks, Chair. The questions that I'd like to ask are in relation to Great British Rail's promised regional structure. Now, it's not a kind of an enabling bill, this, isn't it? It's compared to some of the bills we've seen, it's 19 clauses, 3 schedules, that the overall aim of a better integration between track and train operators is laudable, but it's how it's going to work in practice, and you've identified some of the concerns which I share about one aspect, and that's the annual reports into increasing private sector involvement. I think that's a bit of a distraction, but how is the relationship going to work between GBR and our regional structures, be they statutory or non-statutory? Because we've got Midlands, East and the North here. We've got the 3 big hitters. Who's going to start?
Other STBs are available.
Others are available.
Exactly.
Others are available, and we have no prejudice or preference.
Yeah, you can kick it off.
Happy to kick off, yeah. So we already have robust governance in place that can underpin this relationship. So as I said earlier, we have a board chaired by an independent chair. We have representation, elected members from all of our local transport authorities, and we have representatives covering all of our planning authorities as well, elected members. So we have democratically elected members on our board. And that board has consistently over the last few years provided advice to the Secretary of State on our priorities. So the systems are already in place. We have also set up additional rail structures. I mentioned our rail leadership group, which is comprised of the leads of the 3 rail task forces in the region, Network Rail, and colleagues from the rail industry as well, which meets in Parliament every 6 months. So there are systems in place there. The other thing I'd say is that STBs can also be the building blocks of collaboration across England as well. So a good example of this is the wider South East Partnership. You may recall in the Rail Reform White Paper, there is a proposal for a wider South East Partnership, and what Transport East, England's Economic Heartland STB, and Transport for the South East STB, we've taken the initiative to start having the meetings of what we think that looks like. So we've met twice now, and we've invited colleagues from the DFT, GBR, Network Rail, to make sure that we have that in place. It's working well, and one example of good collaboration between ourselves and England's Economic Heartland is on the case for Ely. You've covered Ely in previous meetings, but this is a rail scheme that is a key priority, not only for our 2 regions, but for other places in the UK as well. And we've collectively worked together on the evidence base for that through our governance to make sure that's clearly communicated to the Secretary of State. So I guess in answer to your question, that governance exists and it's ready to go.
Can I just ask about the annual business plan? I mean, we're used to control periods of 5 years, planning ahead, maybe in light of circumstances and financial settlements, seeing those modified or tweaked, but not a radical change of direction every year. I'm looking for advice as to what we as a select committee should comment in respect of the rail reform bill. Should we be looking for a longer term plan? I'm not putting words in your mouth.
If I may take up the thread there, Mr. Morris. So it is slightly different, as you know, in Transport for the North. So we already, through the regional specifier, have the ability to feed in the strategic outcomes of our strategic plan into the business planning requirements that are currently, as you say, on an annual basis. We also are in a situation in the North where our main operators are actually all owned and operated by the same company, operator of last resort. So we know from the conversations we have with OLR that the way they approach their planning is to look at the 5 and the 10-year time horizon. Now, that feels much more akin to what we should be doing, and it allows you to plan more efficiently and effectively. And within the Rail North agreement that we have at the moment, we're just about to embark upon a rebasing of the service specification for the Northern Rail services, which will look at what we're looking for the next 10 years. And that will be the basis then that is used as the baseline for subsequent contracts. So I think there are examples we've got where we are working, because we have the benefit of working with the OLR, we can look at that 5 and 10 year time frame. We know that that's the framework they're looking at, and it does allow you to think a little bit longer. And I think going back to an earlier comment from Newlands about how you move away from measuring things over 12 months when in the rail sector you're looking at a 5 or a 10 year programme of work to be delivering.
Maria?
Yes, so in terms of the engagement with STBs, back to your question, yes, the structures are in place. Interesting, each region is different. Our colleagues actually saying there's not combined authorities. In the Midlands, we now got a total of 3 in the next year. We got obviously the West Midlands Combined Authority, the East Midlands just established County Combined Authority, and there's one in Lincolnshire on its way. Each of them, the devolution agenda at that city region level, is got clear also local devolution pursuits and ambitions, as Andrew says. We are very supportive of that. What is important from GBR perspective to acknowledge is the Midlands Connect, as it stands, acknowledges that pursuit or local devolution at combined authority level, but those don't cover the whole Midlands. And a lot of the trips and the strategic movements that we're pursuing for economic purpose are pan-Midlands wide. They're also east-west. And at the moment, one of the points we're also making is the current strategies and route strategies of Network Rail, which hopefully GBR, whether they'll take the same or not, actually it's all about north-south. And therefore, we feel a gap in terms of make sure that they all talk to each other and cross-border as well. So we are there to provide a good testing platform for GBR to make sure that all the different regions talk to each other. There's a wider link to wider transport, and it's not. It links to the change in the culture of what we got at the moment of the organisation.
Order. I fear the division bell has gone, so I propose we suspend for 15 minutes to allow colleagues to go and vote. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome back to today's session of the Transport Select Committee, following our short adjournment for a division in the House. Graham, you were in the process of asking some questions to Maria. Can we just pick up from that point, please?
I think we were just trying to establish the relationship between the new body and the regional structures, and in particular, if there are any amendments that we could suggest to the bill to reinforce partnership working with the regions.
Thank you. So yes, thank you. As I say, in each region, it kind of is different, which in a way, the requirements for the bill needs to be flexible to acknowledging that changing landscape and the evolution across the country. You cannot just develop something copy-pasted across England. Absolutely right. So acknowledging existing structures, you know, in the Midlands, as was referring earlier, we got a well-established combined authority in the West Midlands with a body in West Midlands Rail Executive that has got really strong ambitions of local rail devolution. You've got a new combined authority emerging in the East Midlands and in Lincolnshire. The Midlands Connect, as a sub-national transport body, it makes sure that in addition to that city, region, commuter network, there's conversations about how the Midlands can come together and how actually we link with wider national infrastructure in terms of roads, energy, and other things like that. So the point that we're making is STBs can be a really good platform rather than, and the challenge is, are we going to create more and more forums or bodies at regional level when you got the structures established through subnational transport bodies. It's about tapping into those structures, and hopefully that will help aid that conversation around the culture change that the railway industry needs in terms of collaborating more with wider industries, with wider and placemaking activities as well at local level. And I think your earlier comment as well about the emphasis on north-south, yes, whereas many regions, including the north, our concern is that the east-west links have been neglected. Absolutely, yes. Martin, do you have any additional thoughts?
I was just going to thank you very much, Mr. Morris, for providing the hook, because my colleagues have sort of talked about the importance of the rail industry, however it might organise itself, working with the subnational transport bodies, because it is an interlinked. So if I go back to my example, we know that places like Manchester Piccadilly are, the capacity there is heavily constrained. There is a balance between what you want to run within Manchester and local rail services as opposed to balancing with TransPennine or indeed services across. Now, in a similar vein, what we're finding with trying to unpack what's happening on the East Coast main line is that what changes there, you're actually making implications for Manchester, the Castlefield corridor. And so you start to understand the importance of looking at these as regions which respect their geography rather than the railway regions. Now, I understand why Network Rail focuses on, let's say, historical regions, but increasingly if you focus on outcomes in terms of the economy, society and decarbonisation, it's a different conversation, which is where the partners that are brought by subnational transport bodies, political and businesses, are absolutely important. And it's why we talk about in our submission double devolution, recognising that the city regions will want to integrate their services across all modes, but the city regions recognise you need to integrate the services between the modes, between the regions.
Thanks. Examples are very helpful. Thanks. Andrew?
Yeah, same as both, yeah.
Thanks, Chair.
Paul, you wanted to...
Yeah, and I apologise for my late arrival. I was in a Westminster Hall debate on buses, so it's a very linked subject. So I really apologise if there's anything that some of this has already been covered. But I was just conscious of Marie talking about we shouldn't cut and paste between the regions. As Martin will know, I'm a North East MP, and we've just got a new combined authority that's don't think it's a month old yet. In terms of where it is, so there's almost like two questions in there. One of which is, you're not going to cut and paste in terms of what happens, but are there best practice and other things that the North East Mayor should be looking at in terms of where, because it is a huge area, 2 million people. Going from the Scottish borders down to my constituency in Durham. So are there things that we should be looking at there to make sure we get that it's got right as to where it is. Then, if I can come back for the second question, Chair, after that, it'll be about the East Coast Main Line and things.
May I, Chair? I mean, if I might, thank you. We have under the Rail North Agreement, which is the contractual arrangement between ourselves and the DfT in respect to those two contracts, we have set up what we call sub-regional business units, of which the North East was the first. And that gives the opportunity for there to be an even stronger local input into the rail timetables in and around that part of the North.
Sorry, could just quick interruption. Can you just define the North East? Does it align with the North East Combined Authority, or does it include Yorkshire and things? Different people define the North East differently, so I just want to make sure I understand what you're talking about.
In terms of the North East Business Unit, yes. I believe, but I will check and confirm with the committee clerk that I believe it reflects your geography in terms of the North East, but I will check and come back to you on that. But that gives an opportunity for the local authorities in that area, and now obviously the combined authority, to have that conversation which allows the integration more within the combined authority area. But it also then allows that to feed into that conversation that we have at a TFN level. So if we go back to some of the conversations around the East Coast Main Line, one of the issues that was a particular contention was the Newcastle across to Manchester services, which was important for the transformation. So that's why I say double devolution, respecting and recognising the leadership at a city region level or a combined authority level, but also recognising you need to work at a regional level to look at that interconnectivity.
Yeah, and just exactly following up on the same sort of thing, I mean, if you talk about the East Coast Main Line, as you rightly say, East Coast Main Line doesn't go anywhere near Manchester, but it certainly affects it.
It does.
You know, the capacity problems that exist on the East Coast Main Line in terms of, you know, trying to fit in your Transpennine traffic and the freight and everything else, leads me into an obvious question, an obvious affirmation of the need for the Leamside line to be put in to increase capacity, as opposed to anything else, and making sure that we get those sort of things. And I think one of the things that the point I'm coming to, a bit waffly here, but the point I'm coming to is the need for the sub-transport authorities to be very cognizant of their neighbours.
Yes.
You know, if I look at the North East one, and the question I would have been coming to was actually whether the North East included the Tees Valley, which is two different mayors in terms of where it is, but it's a very much an integrated transport network need.
So I wouldn't disagree with you at all, Sahal, in terms of the importance of having that relationship. I mean, that is, of course, one of the benefits of having the TfN board. You know, the members of the TfN board, in effect, have a statutory role in the rail industry by being part of a statutory body. Alongside, of course, Network Rail is a member of the TfN board to actually have that link. We have the link with the operators through the Rail North agreement. So I think it reinforces the importance of empowering the mayors in their combined authorities and allowing them to provide the leadership rightly about how local transport services. But if we're going to transform the North, as is set out in the Strategic Transport Plan, that interconnectivity between those major cities and towns, which is why Northern Powerhouse Rail, of which the Leamside line is such an important part, the Northern Powerhouse Rail in full is absolutely that interconnection across the North.
Thank you.
Thank you. One further area I'd just like to get your opinion on is that of ticketing. It was initially envisaged that GBR would have this central ticket platform, but that proposal was later withdrawn, and the argument was the market will be able to devise its own mechanisms, and we've heard evidence for and against that during the course of our inquiry. Given that within your regions, many of the areas are looking at developing their own integrated ticketing, multimodal products. From that perspective, do you think it's helpful or unhelpful to have within GBR this central platform? Maria?
Right, you just touched on a very current debate in the Midlands. We're very lucky to have an amazing product in the West Midlands, which is called the Swift product. It's the smart ticketing card, one of the few that is starting to actually link into the railways as well. And then you got in Nottingham, you got the Robin Hood card as well. So we do have two smart ticketing products in the Midlands. Now, Midlands Connect was tasked to look at how they could start talking to each other. You know that at the moment, cross-city lines will go from Birmingham to Nottingham, Birmingham to Leicester, you know. So therefore, the last thing you want to have three products. You'll have a Swift card to go into Birmingham by tram and bus. Then you'll have to get a new ticket to go for the train ticket to Nottingham, and then another smart ticket to go from Nottingham, you know, use the tram to get to wherever in Nottingham. So we're doing a pilot through a new product that we call the broker product, that it's friendly for private operators too. And we are developing a massive business case of how you might want to span that across the Midlands. We have set up another forum with all of the other STVs and all of the local transport authorities in the Midlands, because we're very keen that we work together in this space. And GBR, we have engaged with them. They are very open to see how we avoid duplication of efforts in terms of technology, investment, and actually develop good commercial models that the private sector will feel comfortable about buying into. As I said, at the moment, in the West Midlands, there's a fantastic Project Coral team that involves Midlands Connect with all of the operators and the combined authority area to trial and progress and accelerate that concept. We're doing a pilot to link that with Nottingham, and the idea is that we're making a business case to roll it out to the rest of the region. So back to your question, Chair, it will be absolutely a disaster if the efforts of GBR was to produce a product that would be for the whole nation, but yet could not be integrated to those local technologies, because the technology is there. We just need to make sure that we don't duplicate and we go in totally different directions. So one for the committee we would welcome to acknowledge. Thank you.
The argument that was put to us in favour of having a GBR central platform is that given the sort of infrastructure costs of establishing the platform are high and potentially exclude new entrants who might want to bring something innovative to the table. If GBR had this central platform, then everyone else, whether it's a private ticket company or an MCA, wanted to come in. As long as that, from your perspective, as long as that platform enabled that cooperation and wasn't a barrier or a duplicate, you would be comfortable with it.
And that's the point that I'm making. At the moment, the concept of developing what that platform means in terms of the technology, the machine that would allow all of the operators to talk to each other across the whole country, that's the concept that we are also exploring, and it's called broker. So what we're saying is, please, let's not duplicate, let's just share the knowledge. There's very few people in the country with that skill set anyway, so let's acknowledge that we need to work together on this. So the concept is good, it's very complicated, and it has to be commercially robust. So what we're saying is, we've been working on this for 4 years, let's make sure the GBR does not go and do this in isolation.
Martin, Andrew, do you concur with that, or do you have a different perspective?
So I would certainly add to I think a comment you made, Chair, earlier about the fact that we need, if we're focusing on what the consumer is looking for, then we need to be listening to the market on these sorts of things. And I think it is sometimes that there's a danger. We think we're creating the right product, but actually it's the market has already taken us in the direction that people and consumers are looking for. We're very supportive of the broker initiative that's been led by West Midlands. We think it's a good model on which to build, and it's something that I would like us to be able to explore in the north as well. I think the only other thing I would add in this, and we've been having this conversation with GBR transition team ourselves. Again, we're in a slightly different position in that we already have extant powers as Transport for the North that would allow us to support our authorities to roll out not just rail ticketing but multimodal ticketing across boundaries. And it's certainly something that we've been looking at as part of the connected mobility approach for the North. And it's, in essence, our role is there to support some of the smaller authorities who might want to be able to give a level of service to their customers or their residents that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do, but doing it on us, really kind of echoing the point Maria's making, doing it in a way which is consistent and compatible across areas so that you don't have a set of bespoke arrangements which frustrate and confuse the consumer.
Thank you.
Just coming in on this, I mean, if you look at the East region, at our southern border, some customers are able to access the TfL system, but across the rest of the region there is nothing. And our transport strategy sets out the aspiration for a multimodal ticketing system. And like the other SDBs, I mean, one of the powers of SDBs is we don't duplicate work and we build and work together. And the work that Maria's doing is incredibly important, and we look to understand how that could be potentially rolled out. The other thing to bring to the table here is that some of the structures, going back to Mr. Morris's question around governance structures, we already have some of the actors in place, for example, through enhanced partnerships with buses who are able to integrate into the SDB thinking, and more broadly across the wider South East, so Transport for the South East, England's economic heartland, who are facing similar challenges, through that potential partnership, able to think about how we roll out integrated multimodal ticketing more widely. So I guess we've got the structures in place to start thinking about how we roll this out, and we want to build on the good work that's been taken place elsewhere in the country, for example the Midlands, so that we can secure the benefits of that. And to Martin's point, we don't duplicate efforts. There's resources put into one system that genuinely benefits everyone and delivers the outcomes that we want to see.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions. I'd just like to finish the session by giving you the opportunity to place on the record any additional points that we haven't covered this afternoon, or indeed you submitted in your written evidence. So you don't have to add anything, but now's your moment if you would like to. Maria, let's come to you first.
Well, we have made it in our evidence presentation, the asks in terms of the acknowledgement of STBs as useful partners, through using the word, the different used by the Welsh minister, partners, not stakeholders, into the shaping of the future of the railways. We're very keen. We understand that ultimately the railways serve a national as well as a regional and local purpose. So this is not about us taking over at all. This is absolutely about us being engaged to the shaping of that, with that understanding that trips will have different purposes. So really important that we make that, we're really keen to see STBs feature strongly in any legislation going forward. The second one is about that long-term, wider integration piece of GBR. And we acknowledge this is just one part of the jigsaw, but let's not lose sight of the overall, and that the railway is part of a wider transport network. Really important to us, and long-term planning as well.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, a couple of points. We haven't mentioned the ORR yet today, and one of the notes that we put in our submission was the relationship opportunity between STBs and the ORR as well, ensuring that ORR could ensure that the IRB properly consults with and seeks advice of the STBs in its business planning and work programme. So there's another linkage that could be made there. But then more broadly, I think integration has been the key theme of today. And just to reiterate the appetite of our members in the East to engage closely in partnership with rail reform, with the DFT, with the integrated rail body. The spirit of devolution is strong in the East, and our local authority leaders would like to have the opportunity to be part of the decision-making process for rail going forwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Final word, Martin?
You have our recommendations in our submission in regards about the IRB in relation to TFN, and indeed we've also touched on the relationship with ORR in our submission. I've mentioned in this session how I think ensuring the objectives that are used by the regulator in deciding and determining whether access should be given to private operators does need to be aligned with other objectives. I think I have a question in my mind at the moment as to whether they are. I would just point you, Chair, to a sort of an observation in our submission in response to your specific question, that the establishment of the IRB in its own right will not necessarily achieve the outcomes envisaged. That's because there has to be a cultural shift in the industry. It's not to say that the industry isn't able to deliver, but it needs to understand it as part of a transport system supporting its communities and its businesses. And that's a cultural shift. And that's why the role of democratically accountable members on bodies like TFN, alongside the business community, is really important, because the role of the railway is absolutely central in terms of transformation. And as we look to celebrating 200 years of railways at Darlington next year, we want to make sure that railways in the north are actually part of the transformation for the next 200 years.
Thank you very much, and we have our final sessions tomorrow with Network Rail, with the Minister and DFT, so you can be assured these points will be raised in that session. But for now, can I thank all three of you again for your time this afternoon. Apologies that we had a commercial break in the middle, but for now, thank you again. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.